It's a delight to be with you here in Bath, and we're going to be looking today at Christian Zionism. I was given this title, looking forward to Armageddon, ? And it was probably based upon my book, Christian Zionism, Roadmap to Armageddon, which was my PhD thesis, exploring the historical roots of the movement, the theological basis, and its political agenda. So my presentation tonight, I hope, will be objective and accurate, so that if any of you identify with Christian Zionism, I hope afterwards you'll say, well, yes, you were accurate in your description, even if we disagree on your conclusions. And so I'm going to be presenting a composite picture of a very diverse movement, and sometimes conflicting movement. But we're going to primarily tonight look at its historical roots and its political agenda. If you'd like to know more about their theological basis, I've got some leaflets which I can give you afterwards. And as Hugh has said, my second book addresses specifically how the Bible is used by Christian Zionists and how we would deconstruct that theological position in very simple ways. But let's begin with a definition. ChristianZionism.org is a website I helped to found as a meeting point of views on the subject. And on there you'll find this definition. Christian Zionists believe that modern Israel is a continuation of biblical Israel and therefore should enjoy special privileges. They declare that it is the responsibility of Christians to support the state of Israel and its policies. And really, just to give you an insight in how Israeli Zionists perceive Christian Zionists, here is a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu. He said in 2012, "I don't believe the Jewish state and modern Zionism would have been possible without Christian Zionism. We value our friends and we will never forget them." So my opening premise is I want to shake up your view as to what Zionism is. We equate normally Zionism with either Israel or Jewish people. But I'm going to show you tonight that Christian Zionism preceded Jewish Zionism by at least 50 years. And today, 9 out of 10 Zionists in the world are Christians. And so when you think of Zionism, it is predominantly, almost exclusively, a Christian political opinion, not a Jewish one. The Jews who are Zionists are a minority. And I'm sure you're aware within the Jewish community there are anti-Zionists as well as Zionists. In the United States, Pew Forum for Research did a survey recently and showed that 25% of American Christians believe it's their responsibility to support the nation of Israel. And when you hone down on the ethnicity of those supporters, you find that 63% of white evangelicals believe it's their responsibility. So you see why in the United States especially there is a dominant position which is pro-Israel. And it's largely driven, as I'll show you in a moment, by the historical roots of this movement. But let me give you an example of an individual. John Hagee is one of the most influential Christian Zionists in the States. He's the founder of Cornerstone in San Antonio, Texas. 30,000 members in their church on Sundays. He said, "The sleeping giant of Christian Zionism has awakened. There are 50 million Christians standing up and applauding Israel. Think of our future together. 50 million evangelicals joining in common cause with 5 million Jewish people in America on behalf of Israel is a match made in heaven." Now, when you factor in Christian Zionists in the UK, Sweden, South Africa, China, around the world, I estimate over 200 million. When you put that against perhaps half of all Jews, maybe 5 million would regard themselves as Zionists, you see the disproportionate ratio of those who support this movement. So let's look at the historical roots of the movement. It goes back to Napoleon Bonaparte and the end of the 18th century, when we'd had a number of apocalyptic events. We'd had the Revolutionary War in the States, we'd had the French Revolution, there was a Civil War coming up in the States, and the Napoleonic Wars. Britain and France were locked in combat. And Napoleon, being strategic, realized that Palestine was strategic to blocking Britain's trade routes to India and Africa. And he therefore posited the idea of persuading, assisting, sponsoring a Jewish French state in Palestine. And so for the first time in 2,000 years, you had a world ruler make an announcement, 1799, Bonaparte, commander-in-chief of the armies of the French Republic, to the rightful heirs of Palestine, Israelites, she, France, offers to you at this very time Israel's patrimony. Rightful heirs of Palestine, hasten. Now, whether Napoleon believed what he wrote from a theological point of view is debatable, but he saw Palestine having a strategic role to play as the land bridge to strengthen the French Empire and weaken the British Empire. And so, although Bonaparte was unable to deliver on that promise, he nevertheless set the price on Palestine. And as we know, subsequently, Britain succeeded where France failed. The first organization that may be described as what we would call proto-restorationist, that is, promoting the restoration of Jews to Palestine, was founded in 1809. It had a very long title to begin with. It was shortened to the London Jews Society. And they initially had a commendable concern to care for the welfare of Jewish refugees living in London, East London especially. And they set up schools and hospitals and institutions to help support Jewish people. But alongside that, they had two other strands. A prophetic strand, which was speculating about how the end of the world was coming, and Britain and the Jewish people had a manifest destiny to fulfill. One of their eccentric leaders, Joseph Wolf, was going off into what is today Russia and Eastern Europe, searching for Jewish communities in order to encourage them to return to Palestine. And alongside that was a more political agenda to persuade British politicians to support the return of the Jews to Palestine. And Henry Drummond, who was a High Sheriff of Surrey, at his home in Albury, in Advent, the time when we reflect upon the end of the world and the return of Christ, began to hold meetings every Advent for between 20 and 40 politicians, including the Prime Minister's son, leading church ministers, to speculate about the end of the world and the role that Napoleon was playing as the Antichrist, and what Britain's role might be in the end times. And so you can visit Albury today, it's in Surrey. And so Henry Drummond persuaded particularly Edward Irving to attend. Edward was a leading Church of Scotland pastor, but he had quite novel views about the end of time and the end of the world and a coming war of Armageddon. He died prematurely, but his ideas were picked up by John Darby, a Church of Ireland minister who helped found the Brethren. And he took the idea of these conferences from Albury and planted them in Powerscourt in Ireland. And there they began to gather over 400 church leaders. But it was this movement that gave rise to Adventism, the Seventh-day Adventists, and Pentecostalism. And alongside that, this movement of Adventism led to the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons and several other end times sects or religious groups focused on the end of the world. Darby's contribution to this mix of theological and political discussion was to argue very strongly that God has two peoples, the church and Israel. And Israel and church are separate. And therefore, passages in the Bible that related to Israel, he argued, apply to the Jews in his generation. And passages about the church apply to the church. And so he argued God had two chosen peoples. The stars in the sky were the church, and the sand on the seashore were the Jews. It's a promise God made to Abraham. He took it very literally in that way. His ideas were picked up by Cyrus Scofield in the United States, and Scofield wrote what's known as the Scofield Reference Bible. It was the Bible used by over half of all preachers and pastors in the mid-20th century. It was a very influential Bible because alongside the Bible text were his notes, his very prescriptive notes as to how the Bible should be interpreted. And those ideas were picked up by D.L. Moody, who was an evangelist, quite popular preacher, who began to develop US equivalents of the conferences in Albury and Power School. They were called the Prophecy Conferences. And these brought hundreds, if not thousands, of preachers and pastors right across the United States to New York, to Chicago and other cities to try and marry what was being said in the newspapers with what the Bible said. End-time eschatology and speculation. Now, I'm not going to go into any more detail as to how we get from there to today, because I'm going to look at the political agenda in a moment. But I said at the beginning, this is a composite movement, and there are three strands. This is how their theology basically evolves. The views about the Jewish people, Israel, Jerusalem, the temple in the Old Testament, those promises are applied today almost as if the coming of Jesus was irrelevant. In fact, Darby said that the New Testament teaching on Jesus was a parenthesis to God's continuing purposes for Israel. The church would go to heaven, but the Jewish people would be God's people on earth. And it developed into two different kinds of theology, and I'm not going to go into detail. One is called dual covenant, the idea that, as I just said, Darby argued that passages in the Bible relate to the church or they relate to Israel. And so God has a separate plan for the Jewish people. And that idea is dominant in countries like Holland, with the Dutch Reformed Church holds to a dual covenant theology. It was also very popular in South Africa, and as we saw there, it led to apartheid. Dispensationalism is a dominant theological view in America, and there we have the church goes to heaven and disappears, and the Jews remain God's people on earth. Now, these ideas, however weird and wonderful they may appear, I want to show that they gained a hearing among significant political leaders. Lord Shaftesbury, for example, in 1840, began to lobby European leaders to encourage them to get behind Britain's agenda to return the Jews to Palestine as part of Britain's empire. And so he began to lobby monarchs and political leaders across Europe on behalf of the Jewish people. Again, using religious language to justify a political agenda. And although Herzl didn't actually coin this phrase, he is associated with it, a land of no people for a people with no land, it's significant that the phrase was being used 50 years earlier by people like Lord Shaftesbury, a country without a nation for a nation without a country. And when Herzl wrote his The Jewish State in 1896, it had already been preceded by William Heschler, who wrote The Restoration of the Jews to Palestine, arguing the same thing. And although most Jewish historians, particularly Zionist historians, who biographies of Herzl very rarely quote any reference to William Heschler. Heschler was the Anglican chaplain in Vienna and a very influential Anglican in lobbying for people like Theodor Herzl and the other early Christian Zionist leaders. And we know this from Herzl's own diary. In Herzl's diary, there is an entry in which he says, "The Reverend William Heschler, chaplain of the English Embassy here, came to see me, a sympathetic, gentle fellow with a long grey beard of a prophet. He is enthusiastic about my solution of the Jewish question," solution being Palestine. Herzl goes on. "He also considers my movement a prophetic turning point, which he has foretold 2 years before. He'd reckoned that the Jews would get Palestine back. The figure he arrived at was 1897, 1898. So Herzl is slightly skeptical, but he's recording the influence of William Heschler in his diary and about the religious agenda here. And then he goes on to say this. This is a quote from Heschler. "We have prepared the ground for you. We Christians have prepared the ground for you Jews," Heschler said triumphantly. And so his comment, Herzl says, "I take him as a naive visionary. He gives me excellent advice, full of unmistakable, genuine goodwill. He is at once clever and mystical, cunning and naive." Everything you look for in a clergyman today. It was because of the lobbying of people like William Heschler that we arrive at the Balfour Declaration. I'm sure you are very familiar with the Balfour Declaration. You may not be aware that it was written by Zionists for the British government. The first draft was written by the Zionist organization, and if you compare the two the wording of the two versions, you'll see the significance of what the Zionist organization wanted the British government to do. His Majesty's government accepts the principle that Palestine should be reconstituted as the, definite article, national home of the Jewish people. His Majesty's government will use its best endeavours to secure the achievement of this object and will discuss the necessary methods and means with the Zionist organization. You compare that with the final version. His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of that object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." Now that's code. As I'll show you in a moment from another quote, there were two concerns here. In fact, there were three concerns. The first is that the British government was advertising the fact that it was going to sponsor a home in Palestine for the Jewish people, meaning it's part of our empire. But secondly, they didn't want to upset the 95 or 98% of the population who were Arab or Palestinian. But equally, they didn't want to be used or exploited by anti-Semites who wanted to get rid of the Jews. Hence, the concern to add that third clause, which protected the rights of Jews to live where they wanted. I'm just going to read a couple of other things from my book, because I can't memorize all of this, but this is very significant, so bear with me. Again, what you may not be aware is that the Balfour Declaration was published to preempt a German declaration, because just as Wellington and Napoleon were competing with each other at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, it was Britain and Germany doing the same thing. Negotiations over a British declaration of support for the Zionists began in early 1917 when Balfour, then British Foreign Secretary, other members of the British government and representatives of the Zionist organisation In October 1917, Balfour learned that Germany was about to issue its own declaration of sympathy with Zionism, and therefore recommended the British cabinet preempt them and get our statement out first. Just imagine what might have happened if Germany had issued it first and worked with the Zionists. Perhaps the history of the 20th century might have been very different. But again, this is very significant. Not only had the Zionist organization written the initial draft for Balfour, the British government's response was also drafted by a Jew, Leopold Amery. Amery was a convert Jew whose mother, Elizabeth Saphir, was Hungarian. Amery had changed his middle name from Moritz to Maurice in order to disguise his origins. As Assistant Secretary of the British War Cabinet, Amery not only wrote the final version of the Balfour Declaration, but was also responsible for establishing the Jewish Legion, the first organized Jewish army in 2,000 years, and forerunner of the IDF. According to the historian William Rubinstein, Amery misled British officials as to his sympathy for the Jews. Indeed, his claims Amery's deception was, quote, possibly the most remarkable example of concealment of identity in 20th century British political history, unquote. Now, the reason the Balfour Declaration was controversial within the Jewish community was because, first of all, the Board of Deputies of British Jews opposed the Zionist movement. It wasn't until the 1940s that the Board of Deputies became pro-Zionist. But secondly, because members of the British cabinet opposed the Zionist agenda. This was Edwin Montagu. He saw Zionism as a mischievous political creed. In an angry memo to his fellow cabinet members, he declared the proposal would be, quote, anti-Semitic in result and prove a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. So there was deep concern within the Jewish community as to what would happen as a consequence of the Balfour Declaration being implemented. But we know that the British government and Balfour were entirely duplicitous in the wording of the Balfour Declaration, because having promised the land to the Jews and promised to protect the rights of the Arabs, we'd already promised it 2 years earlier than that we were going to keep it for ourselves. In a letter to Lord Curzon in 1919, Balfour made this statement. I think it's probably one of the most honest statements by a British politician that we've ever had in history. He said this: "For in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires or prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land." And here it comes. "So far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong." You get that? "And no declaration of policy which, at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate." Now, why would he admit that? It's because 2 years earlier, before the Balfour Declaration, Britain and France had signed the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was an agreement halfway through the First World War that, having defeated Germany, Britain and France would carve up the Middle East between our two empires. And the French would get parts of what is Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon, and Britain would get the Gulf states, Iraq, and what is today Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, and so on. So we promised it three ways. We'd promised it to the Jews, to the Arabs, and to ourselves. So perhaps it's not surprising that after that declaration was made, increasingly both the Jewish community and the Palestinians realized that Britain was not going to keep its promises. And so the partition plan which emerged in 1947, was Britain's attempt to get out because we were being attacked by both the Jews and the Arabs. And if you look at the partition plan, you notice something very significant. It's like a chessboard. 3 black squares and 3 white squares. Do you see what we were offering? The Arab state would get Gaza, the West Bank, and Galilee, and the Jews would get the Sinai, the Mediterranean, and parts north of the Sea of Galilee in what is on the Israeli side of the Golan. Now, why would this be a plan put forward by the British government? Because neither side was contiguous. Neither side was viable. It was an exit strategy that would require both sides to fight each other to achieve their agenda. And so it was Britain's exit strategy, and that's why we have the conflict we have today. It's continuing because of Britain's duplicity in at the time, our shrinking empire. That's all I really want to say about the history. But simply to say that, as I said earlier, it's a composite movement. And there are at least 3 strands within the movement. You have what's called the Messianic Christian Zionists, people like Jews for Jesus, who have an evangelistic agenda. They are seeking to lead Jewish people to faith in Jesus. Alongside that, you have what I would call the Apocalyptic Christian Zionists. These are predominantly American, and they are predominantly writers of speculative books about the end of the world. And they take the contemporary newspapers and turn them into non-fiction books. So Hal Lindsey, probably the most prolific writer, has written about 30 books, but he's actually only written about 6. And what he does is he does a second or a third edition and changes the last chapter in the light of contemporary events. The Antichrist is the communists, and then it's the communists and the Arab influence over the communists, and then it's the Arabs, and then it becomes the Islamists. Saddam Hussein was the Antichrist, and when Saddam Hussein goes, it's Ahmadinejad. When Ahmadinejad is gone, it's got to be someone else. They're always looking for an Antichrist figure, and this is the kind of books that are very popular in Christian bookshops. And then you have the political pragmatists, who are not involved in proselytism, and they're not involved in apocalyptic speculation, but they are purely there to be a front for the Israeli government. And so people like John Hagee, Franklin Graham, for example, I would put in that category. So at least 3 strands within this movement. That's the historical roots. Let me now give you an idea of where their theology is leading our world today. I'm going to, again, give you an idea of their political strategy or agenda that is a composite picture. Not all Christian Zionists would identify with all elements, but if you put them all together, this is what we have today. And the most important part of their work is in lobbying on behalf of Israel. Lobbying the US president, lobbying British prime ministers, lobbying political leaders, both in the States, in Britain, and every country where there is a significant interest in Israel. So probably the most influential organizations are these 5: Christian Friends of Israel, International Christian Embassy, Bridges for Peace, Jerusalem Prayer Team, and Christians United for Israel. And you'll find them on Sky TV, if you find the right channel. You will find them influencing churches, particularly Pentecostal churches and independent churches in the UK. Although these are American organizations, they are truly international, involving tens of millions of participants and advocates. In Britain, we have Anglican Friends of Israel, Catholics for Israel, Baptists for Israel, Quaker Friends of Israel, Pentecostal Focus on Israel, just like you have Conservative Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel, Lib Dem Friends of Israel, and so on. They are all part of that movement, lobbying politicians, lobbying Christian leaders, lobbying anyone who will listen to them on behalf of Israel. The second element of their strategy is to fund the emigration of Jewish people to Palestine. And the International Christian Embassy, since 1980, is just one example of one organization that has assisted tens of thousands of Jewish people from Russia, from Ethiopia and other countries to make Aliyah and move to live in Palestine, invariably in the settlements. And if you go to their website, you'll see their latest fundraising campaign to raise money in order to assist Jewish people to go and live in Palestine. Welcoming Ethiopian Jews back home, home meaning Palestine. The third element of their strategy is supporting the illegal settlements, the colonies in Palestine. And there's an organization called Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, CFOIC. And their role is to be the face of the settlements in churches. And back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, on their website, they were encouraging churches to adopt a settlement. And if you think that's a little eccentric, you have to remember that some of the churches have tens of thousands of members, and some of the settlements might have 100 settlers. So you see where the power lies. Funding them. International Christian Embassy, for example, was raising money for bulletproof buses to enable the settlers to get in and out of their settlements before the wall was built, because they had to go through Palestinian villages. Armor-plated buses provided by Christian organizations to support and sustain the settlements. Stand with Israel and make a difference. Christian Friends of Israeli Communities encouraging churches to support members of the IDF. You may or may not be aware that young, idealistic Jewish people in Britain and America and other countries decide to go and serve in the Israeli army because they feel it's their obligation to support what Israel is doing through the army. And so Christian Friends of Israeli Communities provides funds and food and other things to help encourage them to do that. And you'll be familiar, during Trump's presidency, he recognized the settlements as part of Israel. And he was doing so because, in part, of the lobbying of Christian groups. Moving embassies to Jerusalem is the fourth element in this strategy. In 1980, the International Christian Embassy was founded at a time when there were no embassies, international embassies in Jerusalem. The few that were remaining vacated between 1967, when Israel annexed Jerusalem, and 1980. And so the International Christian Embassy was founded so that Christians could show solidarity with Israel and have their embassy in Jerusalem. And I think, ironically, it was the former home of Edward Said's family. Donald Trump, as part of his election campaign, promised to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem. Now, what's the significance of moving an embassy? Well, let me show you this quote from Trump after he had done it. This quote suggests that he is surprised at what's happened. He said, "We moved the capital of Israel to Jerusalem." He understood what it meant to move a US embassy to Jerusalem. It was a recognition that Jerusalem is the sovereign capital of Israel, and if America does it, everyone else has to do the same. But notice what he says. That's for the evangelicals. I did it for the evangelicals. You know, it's amazing at that. The evangelicals are more excited about that than the Jews. Do you see? Because they were driven by a religious agenda translated through political action to persuade the president to move the US embassy to Jerusalem. And just to bring it up to date, this week our Prime Minister informed Mr. Lapid about her review of the current location of the British Embassy in Israel. Today in the Church of England newspaper, there's an article, I believe it's there, of Cardinal Nichols, the Roman Catholic leader, warning the British government that doing so will have significant destructive ramifications. I would love to see a similar statement from other Christian leaders in the UK, but I'm not holding my breath. A fifth element of their agenda is accusing critics of anti-Semitism. So, for example, increasingly, Jonathan Sacks, for example, insisting anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. Criticizing a political system for being racist is not racist. See the fusion of the two. And it's deeply disappointing that not only have political parties adopted the IHRA definition, but church leaders have as well, including the Church of England. And without preempting the outcome of an ecclesiastical tribunal, which will be made public in 2 to 3 weeks' time, my hope and expectation will be that it will create a legal precedent which will show that using the IHRA definition is inadmissible or unacceptable in legal terms. It will create a legal precedent to show that it is not a definition. By definition, a definition that's indefinite is not a definition. And simply the use of the word may, this may be anti-Semitic, creates an indefinite definition. So by definition, it's not a definition. But we wait to see the outcome of the tribunal after 4 years. More controversial still, you will find support for the temple movement. There are groups within Israel today, including the Temple Mount Faithful, just one example, who want to destroy the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the Jewish temple. What for? To reinstitute animal sacrifices. Because at the heart of the Orthodox Judaism is the belief that you must have sacrifice for atonement. And so Gershon Solomon, the founder of the Temple Mount Faithful and Land of Israel Faithful movement, is one of the advocates in favor of this. And on the anniversary of Tish B'Av in July, when Jews mourn the destruction of the temple, he takes not only a replica of the temple, but encouraging his followers to take the Temple Mount. And increasingly, we've noticed in the last 2 or 3 years that until the last few years, Orthodox leaders forbade Orthodox Jews from going anywhere near the Temple Mount because they might stand on the Holy of Holies. That's completely been reversed, and now we have rabbis from the settlements regularly taking their followers onto the Temple Mount to pray. But this is what Gershon Solomon said in the London Times in around 2012. The mission of the present generation is to liberate the Temple Mount and to remove, I repeat, remove the defiling abomination there. The Jewish people will not be stopped at the gates leading to the Temple Mount. The Israeli government must do it. We must have a war. There'll be many nations against us, but God will be our general. I am sure this is a test that God is expecting us to move the dome with no fear from other nations. And then he said this: the Messiah will not come by himself. We should bring him by fighting. That's precisely what the Zealots tried to do at the time of Jesus. The belief that as we step out in faith, God will deliver us. And on that anniversary, Solomon and his friends literally take stones weighing several tons on articulated lorries to the Temple Mount. And the Israeli High Court has given them permission to do so. It's only because of the police who restrict access to the Temple Mount that they don't get through. But every year they seek to take the stones to lay the cornerstones to rebuild the Jewish temple. And if you want more information about where to send your donations, I'm joking. These are the kind of books which you can find in Christian bookshops that will describe this movement and their agenda. Lastly, they are fueling the conflict. If you haven't worked that out by now, let me explain how. Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, said this in the Charlotte Observer newspaper: the Arabs will not be happy until every Jew is dead. They hate the state of Israel. They all hate the Jews. God gave the land to the Jews. The Arabs will never accept that. Just imagine if he'd reversed that. The Jews will not be happy until every Arab is dead. They all hate the Arabs. If he'd said that, it would be anti-Semitic. But it's open season to express Islamophobic views. Ann Coulter, very popular writer and TV personality. This was admittedly after 9/11, where sensitivities were raw, but she nevertheless said this: we should invade their countries, kill our leaders, and convert them to Christianity. We weren't punctilious about locating and punishing only Hitler. We carpet bombed German cities. We killed civilians. That's war, and this is war. You know, when Bush initiated Operation Desert Storm, do you know what it was going to be called? Operation Infinite Justice. And he was persuaded away from using religious language that would not go down well with the coalition of Arab states. And this one, finally, from John Hagee. This admittedly was when Ahmadinejad was leader. But notice how the equation is made. It is 1938. Iran is Germany. Ahmadinejad is the new Hitler. We must stop Iran's nuclear threat and stand boldly with Israel. Iran is a clear and present danger to the United States of America and Israel. And that it's time for our country to consider a military preemptive strike against Iran if they will not yield to diplomacy. You have a Christian leader calling upon the US administration to bomb Iran. And that kind of sentiment can be found in numerous books. This is just a selection of books that I have in my library of Christian Zionist authors, but you'll find many, many more. But you can see from the titles and the imagery that it goes right back to those speculations about Napoleon and his agenda and Britain's role what Britain's role might be, or Napoleon's role might be in the end of times. We're back in very troubled waters, very disturbed minds. This is their agenda, their political agenda, and that's why I take it very seriously, and that's why I get into a lot of hot water speaking about it. I've given you the historical roots. We've looked at the political agenda. I'm going to conclude very briefly with a constructive response. How do you respond to this kind of fusion of religion and politics? You know, it's not that long ago that you found religious leaders justifying apartheid in South Africa. It was the institutional churches that backed racism in South Africa. It was not that long ago when churches stood behind Hitler and racism in Germany. It was not that long ago when Christian leaders in Britain and America justified slavery. And notwithstanding your views on the Ukraine and Russia, you find religious leaders in Russia backing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what is a response? Well, I can only share examples of responses from within the Christian community, but there are many. But I want to commend the work of Kairos Palestine. Kairos is a Christian organization that brings to many Christian leaders from different denominations working in Palestine. Thank you. I hope that's just water. But if you go to Kairos Palestine, you'll find some excellent resources on how to confront this kind of theology. And in the UK, Sabeel Kairos is two groups that have come together, Sabeel and Kairos, working together to bring about justice, peace, and reconciliation in Palestine on the basis of equality between Jews and Palestinians. But it has to be based on justice first. So I commend the work of Sabeel Kairos. A number of years ago, I helped to draft a statement which was initially endorsed by an international gathering organized by Sabeel in Jerusalem, but then it was subsequently endorsed by the heads of churches in Palestine, and it became known as the Jerusalem Declaration of Christian Zionism. And in it, it says this: we categorically reject Christian Zionist doctrines as a false teaching that corrupts the biblical message of love, justice, and reconciliation. We further reject the alliance of Christian Zionist leaders and organizations with elements in the governments of Israel and the United States that are presently imposing their unilateral, preemptive borders and domination over Palestine. Rather than condemn the world to the doom of Armageddon, we call upon everyone to liberate themselves from ideologies of militarism and occupation. Instead, let them pursue the healing of the nations. And as I said, that was signed by the then heads of churches in Jerusalem. More recently, last year, we had an important conference, Sabeel Kairos, where we addressed Israeli apartheid. And the closing statement, which was endorsed by members, said this: having considered a Christian response to Israeli apartheid, we affirm that all people are created equally in the image of God. We commend the B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch documents designating Israel as an apartheid state. We repudiate all forms of racism and discrimination, and we recommit ourselves to working for justice, peace, and reconciliation in Israel-Palestine. I think we were the first Christian organization to make such a statement and identify what Israel is doing today with apartheid. A couple of quotes just to leave you with. Martin Luther King said this: "Non-violence is a powerful and just weapon. It is a weapon unique in history, which cuts without wounding. It is a sword that heals." And finally, a quote from Desmond Tutu. He said, "The end of apartheid stands as one of the crowning accomplishments of the past century, but we would not have succeeded without the help of international pressure." Contrast that with Netanyahu's quote. Netanyahu indebted to Christian Zionists. Desmond Tutu saying indebted to Christians committed to justice, peace, and reconciliation. He said, if apartheid ended, so can this occupation. But the moral force and international pressure will have to be just as determined. That's our homework tonight. If you'd like to explore this further, we have an upcoming conference, 25th of October. It'll be online. The Convivencia Declaration is bringing together Christians, Jews, and Muslims here in the UK and internationally to lobby for a one democratic state. The two-state solution is dead. It's a dead parrot. There is no way there will ever be an independent, sovereign, contiguous Palestinian state, not the way the world is going at the moment. One democratic state, repudiating Zionism, repudiating apartheid, where refugees have the right to return, where everyone has the same rights, equal rights. And this particular conference, we have Alan Bosak, international anti-apartheid campaigner, Johnny Clark from Coromolina in Northern Ireland, Rifat Cassis from Kairos, Mark Braverman from Kairos, USA, speaking on the subject. If this has really whetted your appetite, you can access my books from my website, stephensizer.com. And if you want to find out more about what I do when I'm not doing this kind of talk, you can check out peacemakers.ngo. It's a charity we set up 5 years ago, working to be catalysts for peacemaking, especially where minorities are persecuted, where justice is denied, human rights are suppressed, or reconciliation is needed. Thank you. And if you want to know more about a Christian response to Zionism, then this is an outline of this book. You can buy the books or you can access them on my website, but if you want the outline, it's a simple deconstruction of their theology. But thank you so much for being so patient with me. Thank you.